The flashbulb memory is seared into my mind like a brand on skin, permanent, painful, perfect in its clarity. A 6-year-old boy with ink-dark hair and eyes the color of midnight storms, standing in the center of a hushed university library, reaching up with trembling, desperate fingers toward a woman he'd only just met. Tears streaming down his small face, carving rivers through the careful mask of bravery he'd worn like armor far too heavy for his small shoulders. "Please," he whispered, his voice breaking on the word. "Can you be my mom, just once?" The woman, Elara Sinclair, 26 years old, head librarian, keeper of silence and secrets, knelt before him in her modest gray cardigan and simple black skirt, her dark hair falling forward as she lowered herself to his eye level. And when she reached out, when her gentle fingers brushed away his tears with a tenderness that seemed to come from somewhere ancient and instinctual, I watched my brother, Dante Moretti, the most dangerous man in Chicago, the king of an empire built on fear and absolute control, completely shatter. I'm Marco Moretti. And this is the story of how a lonely boy's impossible question changed 3 lives forever. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to where it really started. Part 1, the invisible woman Elara Sinclair had perfected the art of being overlooked. In a city like Chicago, where everyone fought tooth and claw for attention, for recognition, for their moment in the spotlight, she'd learned that invisibility was its own kind of superpower. The university library was her domain, 3 floors of leather-bound knowledge, whispered conversations, and the particular silence that only exists in places where people come to think. She moved through the stacks like a ghost. Shelving books with practiced efficiency, her hands tracing spines with the kind of reverence most people reserved for sacred texts. And maybe to her, they were. At 26, she'd already built a life that revolved around order, quiet, and the safety of predictability. Her apartment was small, a studio in a neighborhood that real estate agents called emerging and residents called struggling. She walked to work every morning at 6:47 a.m., arriving exactly 13 minutes before the library opened. She ate lunch at her desk, usually a sandwich she'd prepared the night before, vegetables cut with geometric precision. She spoke softly, moved carefully, and made it her mission to help students find what they needed without ever drawing attention to herself. Most people didn't know her name. The students called her the quiet librarian. The faculty knew her as Miss Sinclair, the efficient one. Even the janitorial staff, who worked alongside her in the early morning hours, referred to her simply as the book lady. Elara had made peace with this. Or at least, she told herself she had. She'd grown up in foster care, 15 different homes by the time she aged out of the system at 18. She'd learned early that making yourself small, making yourself useful, making yourself forgettable was the key to survival. Don't cause trouble. Don't expect too much. Don't dream of belonging somewhere permanent. So she built her life around books, stories where other people found families, fell in love, saved the world. She lived vicariously through characters who were brave enough to risk everything for connection, while she remained safely behind her desk, behind her carefully constructed walls. But I need you to understand something about invisibility. It's not the same as being empty. Just because people don't see you doesn't mean there's nothing there. Elara Sinclair had depths that would drown the unwary. She volunteered at a women's shelter every Thursday evening, teaching literacy classes to women escaping abuse. She donated 20% of her modest salary to foster care organizations. She kept a small notebook where she wrote poetry she'd never show another soul, verses about loneliness and longing and the particular ache of watching other people build the families she'd never had. She was kind without expecting recognition. Generous without demanding gratitude. Strong in a way that people mistook for fragility. And she was lonely in a way that most people couldn't even comprehend. But what happened next? Well, that's when invisibility met inevitability. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late October when Dante Moretti first walked into the Carter Memorial Library. I need you to picture this man. 6'3" of controlled violence in an $8,000 suit. Dark hair swept back from a face that belonged on Roman coins, all sharp angles and calculated cruelty softened only slightly by eyes that might have been beautiful if they weren't so cold. He moved like water poured over stone, fluid and unstoppable, and every person in his path unconsciously stepped aside. He commanded space without saying a word. At 34, Dante had built an empire that operated in shadows. The Moretti family controlled everything from the docks to the downtown construction contracts, from the unions to the underbelly of Chicago's political machine. Nothing moved in this city without his knowledge. Nothing happened without his permission. People feared him. Respected him. Never, ever crossed him. But walking beside him, clinging to his hand with desperate determination, was the crack in his armor. Lorenzo. 6 years old, small for his age, with his father's dark hair and his mother's absence carved into every uncertain movement. I watched them from my position near the reference desk. I'd come to the library ostensibly to research something innocuous, but really to keep tabs on my nephew, who'd been struggling in ways that worried even me, and I wasn't exactly the sensitive type. Dante approached the circulation desk where a nervous undergraduate student worker sat, and I saw the kid go pale. "I need children's books," Dante said, his voice carrying that particular quality of command that made it clear this wasn't a request. "Educational. Something about families." The student stammered something about sections and Dewey Decimal, but Dante's expression made it clear he had neither the time nor the patience for library science. That's when Elara appeared. I didn't see where she came from, she just materialized beside the student, gently touching his shoulder in a gesture that managed to be both reassuring and dismissive. She looked up at Dante with absolutely no fear in her expression, which was remarkable because most people looked at my brother the way rabbits look at wolves. "I can help you," she said simply, her voice low and surprisingly firm. Dante studied her for a moment, this small woman in her oversized cardigan and practical shoes, her hair pulled back in a simple bun, her face bare of makeup but somehow luminous in the afternoon light filtering through the tall windows. "You're the head librarian," he said. It wasn't a question. Dante always did his research. "I am," Elara confirmed. Then she looked down at Lorenzo, and something in her expression softened in a way that made my chest tighten. "And who's this handsome young man?" Lorenzo pressed closer to his father's leg, his small hand tightening on Dante's fingers. "My son," Dante said, and there was something in his voice, pride and pain tangled so tightly you couldn't separate them. "He needs books. For a school project." Elara nodded slowly, then did something that surprised everyone. She knelt down, bringing herself to Lorenzo's eye level, making herself small and non-threatening in a way that spoke of genuine understanding rather than condescension. "Hi, Lorenzo," she said softly. "My name is Miss Elara. I know this library might seem big and kind of scary, but I promise it's actually a wonderful place. Would you like me to show you where we keep the really special books? The ones with the best pictures?" Lorenzo looked up at his father, seeking permission, and Dante gave a small nod. "Okay," Lorenzo whispered. And just like that, Elara Sinclair became visible to the Moretti family. I followed at a distance as Elara led them through the library, watching the way she moved, careful not to walk too fast, checking over her shoulder to make sure Lorenzo was keeping up, explaining things in a voice just loud enough for him to hear but quiet enough to maintain the sacred hush of the space. She took them to the children's section, a corner of the third floor where primary colors and soft cushions created a world entirely separate from the serious academic atmosphere of the main floors. "This," Elara said, settling onto one of the cushions with a grace that suggested she did this often, "is where all the best stories live. Books about adventures and animals and families and brave kids who do amazing things." Lorenzo approached cautiously, his eyes wide as he took in the shelves bursting with colorful spines. "Your dad said you need books about families," Elara continued, pulling several titles from the shelf with practiced ease. "I have some favorites I think you might like. This 1-inch," she held up a picture book with a warm illustration on the cover, "is about a family of bears. And this one is about a boy who gets adopted by his grandfather. And this one is special." She held up a slim volume with a simple cover, The Family You Choose. Dante's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and I knew that title had hit something tender. Can I look at them? Lorenzo asked, his voice barely audible. Of course, Elara said warmly. That's what they're here for. Take your time. I'll be right here if you need help with any words. And she stayed. For the next 45 minutes, while Lorenzo carefully turned pages and Dante stood nearby with his arms crossed and his expression unreadable, Elara sat on that cushion and waited. Not hovering, not pressuring, just present. When Lorenzo finally selected 3 books, Elara stood and guided them back to the circulation desk, processing the checkout with efficient kindness. These are due back in 2 weeks, she said, handing the books to Lorenzo directly rather than to Dante. But if you need more time with them, you can always renew them. And if you'd like, you can come back anytime and we can find more books together. Lorenzo clutched the books to his chest like treasures. Thank you, Miss Elara, he said, and the genuine gratitude in his small voice could have melted stone. Elara smiled, really smiled, not the polite professional expression she usually wore, but something genuine and warm that transformed her entire face. You're very welcome, Lorenzo. As they left, I saw Dante pause at the door, looking back at where Elara had already returned to her desk, once again becoming part of the library's quiet landscape. Something had shifted. I could feel it the way you feel a storm coming before the first drop of rain falls. But what none of us knew was that this was just the beginning. Part 2, The Lonely King. Let me tell you something about my brother that most people don't know. Dante Moretti is the loneliest man I've ever met. You wouldn't think it to look at him. He has power, wealth, influence. People line up to be near him, to earn his approval, to bask in his presence. But proximity isn't the same as connection. And Dante had spent so many years building walls around himself that he'd forgotten what it felt like to let someone in. Lorenzo's mother, Dante's ex-wife, Isabel, had left when the boy was barely 1 year old. Couldn't handle the uncertainty, she'd said. Couldn't live with the knowledge that her husband's business dealings might one day result in violence coming to their door. Couldn't love a man who operated in moral gray zones, who made decisions she couldn't reconcile with her suburban dreams of normalcy. She was probably right to be scared. But she was absolutely wrong to leave Lorenzo. The divorce had been quiet, expensive, and brutal. Isabel had signed away her parental rights in exchange for a settlement that set her up comfortably in California, far away from Chicago and everything that reminded her of the life she'd escaped. She sent birthday cards twice a year, always late, always generic. She never called. Never visited. Never asked how her son was doing. And Dante. Dante carried that abandonment like a physical wound. Not for himself, he'd learned long ago not to expect loyalty from people who didn't share his blood. But for Lorenzo, who asked questions Dante didn't know how to answer. Why doesn't mommy love me? Did I do something wrong? Do other kids have moms who left? Dante had hired nannies, a parade of well-credentialed women who were efficient and professional and utterly incapable of filling the maternal void in Lorenzo's life. They were employees, and Lorenzo was smart enough to know the difference between someone paid to care and someone who cared by choice. The library visit had been a last-ditch effort on Dante's part. Lorenzo's first-grade teacher had assigned a project: create a family tree, bring in photos, write about what makes your family special. For most kids, it was easy. For Lorenzo, it was torture. Dante had spent 3 nights trying to figure out how to help his son complete an assignment that required acknowledging the person who'd abandoned him. And in his desperation, he'd done something he rarely did: he'd asked for help. Hence, the library. Hence, Elara Sinclair. What happened next, though, that's where everything changed. They came back the following Tuesday. This time, Lorenzo walked in with more confidence, heading straight for the children's section like he owned the place. Dante followed, and I watched from my usual vantage point as Elara appeared again, materializing from between the stacks with that same gentle presence. "Hi, Lorenzo," she said warmly. "Back for more books?" Lorenzo nodded eagerly, then hesitated, his small face scrunching up in thought. "Miss Elara, can I ask you something?" "Of course. Do you know about moms?" The question hung in the air like smoke, and I saw Elara's expression shift, not with pity, but with understanding that cut deeper than sympathy. "I know some things about moms," she said carefully, kneeling down to his level again. "What would you like to know?" "My school is having a Mother's Day breakfast," Lorenzo said, his voice getting smaller with each word. "All the other kids are bringing their moms. But I don't have a mom. She went away when I was really little, and she doesn't come back." Behind him, Dante's hands curled into fists, his entire body radiating controlled tension. Elara was quiet for a moment, and I could see her choosing her words with the care of someone defusing a bomb. "Lorenzo," she said finally, "not having your mom there doesn't mean you're not loved. Your dad loves you very much. I can see it in the way he looks at you, the way he brings you here to find books, the way he wants to help you with your school project. But all the other kids will have moms," Lorenzo repeated, and his eyes were starting to glisten with tears he was fighting hard to contain. "I'll be the only one without one. Everyone will know I'm different. That something's wrong with me." "Nothing is wrong with you," Elara said fiercely, and the sudden steel in her voice made even Dante look up sharply. "Do you hear me, Lorenzo? Nothing about you is broken or wrong or less than. Sometimes parents leave, and it's not because of anything their kids did. It's because the parents couldn't be brave enough to stay. That's on them, not on you." Lorenzo's tears spilled over, and without thinking, without hesitation, Elara pulled him into a hug. And Lorenzo, this little boy who'd been so careful, so guarded, so afraid of wanting something he couldn't have, melted into her embrace and sobbed. I watched Dante's face, and I saw something I'd never seen before, my brother, the unbreakable criminal king, on the verge of tears himself. Elara held Lorenzo until his crying slowed, then gently pulled back to look at him. "When is this breakfast?" she asked. "Friday morning," Lorenzo sniffled. Elara glanced up at Dante, and something passed between them, a question asked and answered without words. Then she looked back at Lorenzo and said something that would change all their lives. "What if I came with you? Just for the breakfast?" "I can't be your mom, Lorenzo, because that's not something we can pretend about. But I could be your friend. Would that help?" Lorenzo's eyes went wide. "Really? You'd really come?" "If your dad says it's okay," Elara said, still looking at Dante, "then yes. I'd really come." Dante stared at her for a long moment, and I could practically see the war happening behind his eyes. Letting a stranger into his son's life. Admitting he couldn't fix this himself. Taking help from someone he barely knew. "Yes," he said finally, and the single word sounded like it had been dragged up from somewhere deep and painful. "If you're willing. Please." And just like that, Elara Sinclair stopped being invisible to the Moretti family. She became essential. Part 3, the bravest question. The Mother's Day breakfast at Lorenzo's school was held in the gymnasium, which had been transformed with pastel decorations and small tables where families could sit together. The smell of coffee and baked goods filled the air, mixing with the sound of children's laughter and mothers' conversations. I wasn't supposed to be there. But Dante had asked me to come, to stay nearby, just in case. He didn't say in case of what, but I understood. This was territory he couldn't control, emotions he couldn't command, vulnerability he couldn't armor against. Elara arrived exactly on time, dressed in a simple blue dress that somehow made her look both professional and approachable. She'd left her hair down, soft waves framing her face, and I noticed several of the other mothers glancing at her with curiosity. Lorenzo spotted her immediately and ran over, his entire face lighting up in a way I'd rarely seen. "You came," he exclaimed. "I promised I would," Elara said simply, and the way she said it, like promises were sacred things that couldn't be broken, made my respect for her deepen considerably. Dante joined them, and the three of them walked into the gymnasium together. They found a table, and I watched from my position near the door as they settled in, looking for all the world like a family. But I could see the cracks. The way some of the other mothers whispered to each other, glancing at Elara with obvious questions in their eyes. The way Lorenzo kept looking at Elara, then at the other kids with their actual mothers, his expression a mixture of gratitude and grief. The way Dante sat with his hands clasped tightly on the table, his jaw set with tension. This wasn't going to be easy. And then came the moment that broke everything open. The teacher, a well-meaning woman in her 50s, announced that each child would introduce their mother and share one special thing about her. One by one, kids stood up. "This is my mom, Sarah. She makes the best chocolate chip cookies. This is my mom, Jennifer. She helps me with my homework every night. This is my mom, Patricia. She gives the best hugs in the whole world." When it was Lorenzo's turn, he stood up slowly, and I saw his hands trembling. "This is..." He started, then stopped, looking at Elara with confusion and pain warring on his small face. Because she wasn't his mom. And everyone in this room knew it. The silence stretched, awkward and terrible, and I saw some of the other children starting to whisper. That's when Lorenzo did the bravest thing I've ever witnessed. He turned to face Elara fully, and tears started streaming down his face. "Can you be my mom?" he asked, his voice breaking. "Not just today. Not just pretending. Can you be my real mom? Please. I promise I'll be really good. I'll clean my room and eat my vegetables and I won't cry when I'm scared and I'll..." "Lorenzo," Elara said, and her own voice was thick with tears. "Please," Lorenzo sobbed, and then he reached up with both hands, framing her face the way a child does when they need an adult to really, truly listen. "I just want someone to love me like other kids' moms do. Just once. Can you love me? Just once." The entire gymnasium had gone silent. Elara's tears were falling freely now, and she pulled Lorenzo into her arms, holding him like he was the most precious thing in the world. "Oh, sweetheart," she whispered, loud enough for me to hear from where I stood. "You don't have to earn love. You don't have to be good enough or quiet enough or perfect enough. Love isn't something you have to deserve." "But my mom left," Lorenzo said into her shoulder. "So something must be wrong with me." "Nothing is wrong with you," Elara said fiercely, pulling back to look at him directly. "Your mom left because she couldn't be brave enough to stay. But that doesn't mean you're not worth staying for. Do you understand me? You are worth staying for." And then she looked up at Dante, and I saw something pass between them that was bigger than words, deeper than promises. "I can't be your mom just once," she said to Lorenzo, still holding his gaze. "Because once would never be enough. If I'm going to do this, if I'm going to be part of your life, it has to be real. It has to be forever. Is that what you want?" Lorenzo nodded desperately. Elara looked at Dante again. "Is that what you want? And my brother, this man who'd built an empire on never showing weakness, on never needing anyone, said the words I never thought I'd hear him say, yes. Please. Stay." I watched as Elara made her choice right there in that gymnasium, in front of dozens of witnesses, with a child's desperate hope clinging to her and a dangerous man's cautious faith resting in her hands. "Then I'm staying," she said. Lorenzo threw his arms around her neck, and she held him like she'd been preparing her whole life for this moment. "And Dante." Dante closed his eyes and let out a breath that sounded like he'd been holding it for 6 years. Part 4, the dangerous truth you need to understand something about what Elara had just agreed to. She hadn't just said yes to helping a lonely child. She hadn't just volunteered to play house for a few weeks until Lorenzo felt better. She'd agreed to enter the world of a man who operated in shadows, whose business dealings would terrify most civilians, whose enemies would gladly use anyone he cared about as leverage. Dante knew this. I knew this. And that night, After the breakfast, after Lorenzo had gone to bed clutching a card Elara had made with him, Dante invited her to his home, a sprawling penthouse overlooking Lake Michigan that was equal parts fortress and museum. I was there too, because Dante had asked me to be. He wanted a witness. Someone to vouch for what he was about to say. Elara sat on the leather sofa, her hands folded in her lap, looking small but somehow undiminished by the opulence surrounding her. Dante stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, backlit by the city lights, and I could see him gathering his courage for this conversation. "Miss Sinclair," he started, then stopped. "Elara. There are things you need to know before you make this choice permanent." "I'm listening," she said, her voice steady. Dante turned to face her fully. "I run a criminal organization. Not small time, I control most of the significant operations in Chicago. Legitimate businesses that launder money. Political connections that bend laws. Enforcement arms that ensure compliance. I've never killed an innocent person, and I have lines I don't cross. But I'm not a good man by conventional standards." He paused, watching her face for signs of fear or judgment. Elara's expression didn't change. "Lorenzo's mother left because she couldn't handle the uncertainty," Dante continued. "The knowledge that my work creates enemies. That those enemies might one day try to hurt my family to hurt me. If you become part of Lorenzo's life, part of our lives, you become a target. People will investigate you. Follow you. Try to use you as leverage." "I understand," Elara said simply. "Do you?" Dante challenged, his voice hardening. "Do you understand what it means to have your freedom restricted? To need security wherever you go? To live with the knowledge that loving us is dangerous?" "Yes," Elara said, and there was steel in her voice now. "I do. Because I grew up in 15 different foster homes, never belonging anywhere, always waiting for the next person to decide I wasn't worth keeping. I know what it means to live with uncertainty. I know what it means to be invisible and vulnerable and powerless." She stood up, crossing the space between them until she was looking up at Dante directly. "But here's what you need to understand," she said firmly. "I'm not choosing Lorenzo because I pity him. I'm not choosing you because I'm naive about what this life entails. I'm choosing this family because for the first time in my life, I've found something worth being brave for. Something worth being visible for." "You could get hurt," Dante said, and his voice cracked slightly on the words. "I've been hurt before," Elara countered. "By people who were supposed to protect me. By systems that failed me. By my own expectations of what I deserved. But I survived all of that. And I'm choosing to believe that I can survive this too." Dante stared at her for a long moment, and I saw something in his expression I'd never seen before: hope. "I can't promise you safety," he said quietly. "I'm not asking for promises," Elara replied. "I'm asking for honesty. For partnership. For the chance to build something real with you and Lorenzo." "Why?" Dante asked, and the vulnerability in that single word was staggering. "Why would you choose this?" Elara smiled, sad and beautiful. "Because sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is exactly what your heart demands. And my heart is demanding that I stay. I watched my brother's carefully constructed walls crumble, and I watched him take the first real risk of his life." He stepped forward and pulled Elara into his arms. "I'll keep you safe," he promised into her hair. "Both of you. I swear it." And Elara, this small woman who'd been invisible for so long, held on to the most dangerous man in Chicago and whispered, "I know." Part 5, The Found Family. I wish I could tell you that everything was perfect after that. I wish I could say that Elara moved in, Lorenzo got his mother figure, Dante found his partner, and they lived happily ever after with no complications. But life doesn't work like that. Especially not in our world. The first month was adjustment. Elara kept her apartment initially, spending days at the library and evenings with Lorenzo and Dante. She established boundaries, she wouldn't live with Dante until they'd figured out exactly what their relationship was, wouldn't let Lorenzo call her mom until she was legally entitled to that name, wouldn't pretend that everything was simple when it was anything but. Dante respected her boundaries, but I could see it frustrated him. He was used to getting what he wanted when he wanted it. But Elara wasn't something that could be commanded or controlled. Lorenzo, for his part, blossomed. I watched my nephew transform from a withdrawn, anxious child into a boy who laughed freely and asked questions and brought home art projects with "My Family" scrawled across the top, drawings that now included 3 stick figures instead of 2. But then came the first real test. A rival organization, trying to expand into Moretti territory, decided that the best way to destabilize Dante was to go after the people he cared about. They'd done their research. They knew about Lorenzo, of course. And they'd learned about Elara. The threat came through back channels. A message that made it clear: back off or we start removing the things you love. Dante's response was swift and brutal. Within 72 hours, the rival organization's leadership had been decimated, their operations shut down, their remaining members too terrified to even speak our family's name. But the incident had made something crystal clear: Elara was in danger simply by being associated with us. Dante tried to end it. I was there when he called her to his study and told her, with as much cold finality as he could muster, that this wasn't going to work. That she should go back to her quiet life at the library. That he'd make sure she was financially secure, but she needed to cut ties with Lorenzo before the boy got even more attached. It was the worst acting I'd ever seen from my brother. Elara sat in a chair across from his desk and listened to his entire speech. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "No." Dante blinked. "What?" "No," Elara repeated, standing up. "You don't get to make this choice for me. You don't get to decide that I'm too fragile or too vulnerable or too much of a liability. I'm not leaving." "Elara, you don't understand." "I understand perfectly," she interrupted, and I'd never heard her voice carry this much force. "You're scared. You're scared that loving me will get me hurt. That your world will destroy something good. But I'm scared too, Dante. I'm terrified. And I'm choosing to stay anyway." "Why?" Dante asked desperately. Elara crossed the space between them, placing her hands on either side of his face in a gesture that mirrored Lorenzo's touch from the library. "Because I love you," she said simply. "Both of you. And love doesn't run at the first sign of danger. Real love stays and fights and builds something strong enough to withstand the storms." "I could lose you," Dante whispered. "You could," Elara agreed. "But isn't that true of everyone we love? Isn't the risk always there? At least this way, we face it together." And that's when my brother, this man who'd been alone for so long, finally let himself be saved. He pulled her into his arms and buried his face in her neck and let himself feel the full weight of what it meant to love someone and be loved in return. "Marry me," he said, the words muffled against her skin. "What?" Elara pulled back to look at him. "Marry me," Dante repeated, meeting her eyes with absolute certainty. "Not because it's practical or because it gives me legal ways to protect you, though it does both those things. Marry me because I can't imagine my life without you in it. Because you've given Lorenzo something I couldn't. Because you've given me something I'd stopped believing existed." "What's that?" Elara asked softly. "Home," Dante said. "You've given us a home." Elara's answer was to kiss him, deep and sure and full of promises. And when they broke apart, she whispered, "Yes." Epilogue: The best family's 3 years have passed since a 6-year-old boy asked an impossible question in a university library. Elara Moretti, yes, she took the name, wore it with pride, still works at the library 3 days a week. She'd refused to give up her career, and Dante had learned to accept that his wife needed her own identity beyond mob wife and mother. Lorenzo, now 9, brings his friends over to study in the library's children's section, where Elara has expanded the program to include literacy tutoring for underprivileged kids. He introduces her with obvious pride, "This is my mom. She's the best librarian in Chicago." Dante has, softened isn't quite the right word. But he's changed. He comes home for dinner. He coaches Lorenzo's soccer team. He holds Elara's hand when they walk through the park. He's still dangerous. Still commands an empire. Still makes people nervous when he enters a room. But he's also learned what it means to be vulnerable. To need someone. To build something that can't be measured in power or money or influence. Last week, they held a small ceremony at the house, a family day celebration that Lorenzo had requested. He'd wanted to officially mark the anniversary of the day Elara had first said yes. As I watched them together, Dante with his arm around Elara's waist, Lorenzo between them wearing a ridiculous party hat, I thought about how much had changed from that first library visit. A dangerous man who'd learned to love. An invisible woman who'd become essential. A lonely child who'd found his family. Lorenzo made a speech, he'd prepared it carefully, written it out on index cards he kept checking. 3 years ago, I asked Miss Elara to be my mom just once, he said, his voice clear and strong. But she said once wasn't enough. She said if she was going to do it, it had to be forever. He looked up at Elara with absolute adoration. "So thank you, Mom. For choosing forever with us." There wasn't a dry eye in the room. Later, after the party had wound down and Lorenzo had gone to bed, I found Dante standing on the terrace, looking out at the city lights. "You did good, brother," I said, joining him at the railing. "She did good," Dante corrected. "She saved us." "You saved each other," I said. Dante smiled, a real smile, not the cold expression he showed the world. "Yeah. I guess we did." And I realized that sometimes the most powerful thing a man can do isn't to build an empire or command fear or accumulate wealth. Sometimes the most powerful thing a man can do is admit he can't do it alone. To open his heart to someone who sees past his armor. To let his son ask the bravest question in the world and trust that the answer will be yes. To build a family not from blood or obligation, but from choice and courage and love. The Moretti family, Dante, Elara, Lorenzo, and even me, watching from the margins, we're not perfect. We're not conventional. We're definitely not safe. But we're real. And we're together. And in the end, that's the only thing that matters. Because the best families don't start with the right circumstances or the perfect conditions or the safest choices. The best families start with the bravest questions. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, someone is brave enough to answer.